Hey guys, we're getting ready for a test on Tuesday. It's going to be over all the kind of basic chemistry stuff that we've gone over. It's hopefully the videos that you've watched have been able to help you. I'm going to start from the very beginning, what will be on the test, to the last part that we've been talking about with biomolecules. This is going to be more of a overview, and I'm going to highlight some things you need to know. Some of you may be taking my chemistry class, chemical systems class, so we're going to go into more detail in that class about atomic structure. I've dealt some of it here, so I'm going to go over what you need to know for biology class, basically. And you need to remember that each box on the periodic table represents an element. Okay. And the atomic numbers and the mass numbers help you to figure out the number of particles, but the three basic particles in an atom are protons, neutrons, and electrons. So the atoms are the building blocks of the world around us. Everything's made of elements, and elements may be chemically combined to form molecules or compounds, but the smallest part of an element is an atom, and the basic parts of an atom are protons, neutrons, and electrons. And it's the electrons that are in the outermost energy level that help to determine the type of molecules or compounds that will be formed depending upon what the atoms are around. And there are two types of bonds that we have discussed. One is an ionic bond, which basically occurs when atoms are trying to stabilize. So they form bonds to become stable, and they're basically stable when their outermost energy level is filled or has 8 electrons. So ionic bonds will form, and it's due to like transferring, giving away, or taking electrons. So it's transfer, or you could say give away, or gain electrons. Transfer, give away, gain electrons. And when you see a diagram, it won't look like this, but when you see, I may have a diagram on a test where it shows the electrons moving to one atom, that's going to be representing an ionic bond. And they do this to gain stability by having their outermost energy level filled, or at least 8 in that outer energy level. So, and what happens is when they gain or give away the electrons, they're losing or gaining a negative charge. If they lose a negative charge, they become a positive ion. If they gain an electron, they become negatively charged. And then the opposite charges attract, and that's what pulls them together. Opposite charges attract. So I'm not going to have you diagram the atoms, and put all the electrons in. I just want you to recognize that atoms will give away or transfer or take electrons to stabilize themselves. And they'll do that to where they have either their outer shell filled or with 8. If it's the smaller atom like hydrogen or helium, they'll be filled with 2. And that having 8 out here is an octet, and that stabilizes the atom. So when electrons are given away, this atom loses a negative charge. It becomes positively charged. If it gave away 2 electrons, it would have a +2 there. If this one gained 2 electrons, it would have to be a -2 charged ion because it had 2 extra electrons. So that's ionic bonding. The covalent bonding, they are also trying to achieve stability by having their outermost energy levels filled. I drew an example of hydrogen, 2 hydrogen atoms. They each have 1 electron apiece. They're the same size atoms. They're neither one going to be willing to give away their 1 electron, but they will share. They will share a pair of electrons, and that means each one has access to both electrons orbiting that nucleus, their nuclei, and that helps to stabilize them. And when they share electrons, they can orbit both atoms. That's covalent bonding. Co meaning sharing. The outermost electrons, let me say that again. The electrons in the outermost energy level are called valence electrons. So that's why it's covalent bonding. Generally happens between nonmetals. If you have 1 pair of electrons being shared, it's 1 dashed line. 2 pairs of electrons being shared, the structural formula has 2 dashed lines. And there are some that have 3 pairs also being shared. Water is an example of a covalent bond. Oxygen has 6 electrons at its highest energy level. To be stable, it's easier for it to gain 2 than give away 6. And if oxygen atoms are only being combined with hydrogen atoms, then each oxygen will link up with 2 hydrogen atoms. Those electrons are allowed to circle both atoms, and it's held together by sharing electrons, so it's a covalent bond. So that's kind of the basic chemistry for right now. Now, went through all this for you to kind of be able to understand why there's so many molecules and compounds involving carbon. And the reason that is because carbon is element number 6. So carbon has 6 electrons, 2 in the first energy level, 4 in the second, and it would like to have 8. So if there's a lot of hydrogen present, that carbon atom will bond with hydrogen. It'll also form bonds with oxygen, and that creates your carbohydrates. Carbohydrates will be combinations of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. And because there's 4 bonding points here, 4 electrons that can be shared, carbon will make huge branched chains of atoms. Sometimes you'll see stuff that looks like this in a picture or a diagram. Those will all be hydrogen. Well, this right here is CH4. You put another carbon here and attach more hydrogen, you end up with a completely different molecule. You add another carbon, fill it around with hydrogen, that's another molecule of different types. So every time you add a carbon, you're changing the molecule. And that's why carbon can form so many different kinds of compounds, because it needs to form 4 bonds to stabilize it. It needs to gain or share 4 more electrons, and it's willing to do that. And so there's thousands of different carbon types of compounds. So that's why we went through all this stuff before, for you to kind of understand when you get to living organisms, how can there be so many different molecules? Well, it's the bonding combination that creates all these different molecules. So you had a handout that went with this particular CK12 reading material. So, significance of carbon, and I'm going to go through the answers with you. Compound found mainly in living things is known as an organic compound. So if it's in a living organisms, it's typically an organic compound, and it needs to have pretty much carbon in it. Organic compounds make up the cells and other structures of organisms and carry out life processes. So these different compounds in your cells reacting with each other is what helps to give us a quality of life. It's not all that's involved, but those reactions happening between these different compounds keeps us functioning. Carbon is the main element in organic compounds. You need to know that. That's a test question. Carbon is the main element in organic compounds. So carbon is essential to life on Earth. Without carbon, life as we know it would not exist. And this right here is going to go through and review you a little bit about elements, compounds. A compound is a substance that's made of two or more elements. A compound is a unique composition that's always the same, like, for example, H2O, CO2. Remember, a compound is different than a mixture. Mixture can be in any ratio. Compounds have a specific ratio of atoms. And the smallest part of a compound that has the properties of that compound is called a molecule. And these compounds have to be chemically combined. And they're going to go through water as an example. You can use a chemical formula like H2O to represent water. You could also use a structural formula. But water is not organic because there's no carbon atoms in it. So they're using water to describe a chemical compound, but it's not an organic compound because there's no carbon in water. Remember that molecules are held together by chemical bonds, and it takes a chemical reaction to have a chemical bond. And here they're talking about carbon again. The reason it's so basic to life, important to life, is its ability to form stable bonds with many elements, including itself. This property allows carbon to form a huge variety of very large and complex molecules. In fact, there are nearly 10 million carbon-based compounds in living things. That's not a test question, but that's kind of an amazing thing. However, the millions of organic compounds can be grouped into just 4 major types. And that's what your next handout is about: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So, and this table does a pretty good job of comparing them. Carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids on the next page. They give you examples. They tell you what elements are present, what their purpose are, and what their building blocks are. Because remember, carbon, I started drawing that really long chain there. That's what they're going to talk about over here. So carbohydrates, examples are sugars and starches. They provide energy: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Lipids are fats and oils: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but a lot of these are not water soluble. Many of those are. Proteins is an enzyme. Example could be an enzyme or an antibody. We've been hearing a lot about antibodies lately. Helps cells keep their shape. It makes up muscles, speeds up chemical reactions. And the basic building block of a protein is an amino acid. Building block of a carbohydrate is a monosaccharide. The lipids don't have a specific building block. And then the nucleic acids, most of you have heard of your DNA, your genetic material, RNA, very similar type elements, helps to pass traits on from parent to offspring. And the building blocks, a nucleotide. So the nucleotides, The monosaccharides and amino acids are like building blocks. The building blocks are called monomers. Mono means one unit. It's like a boxcar on a train. A polymer would be many monomers linked together. Example, a train with multiple boxcars linked together. So a monomer is like one train car. A polymer is when you take a bunch of train cars and link them together, you get a polymer. So here, your carbohydrates are your polymers, but the building block, the train car for a carbohydrate, is a monosaccharide. It's a simple sugar. You link them together, they become more complex. Proteins. The basic boxcar of a protein, the basic building block of a protein, is amino acid. You can link chains of amino acids together and you get different types of proteins. DNA or RNA. Your basic building block of a DNA or RNA molecule is a nucleotide. Okay? So you do need to know that these are your 4 categories and you need to know their building blocks. Okay. All right. Now, these 4 things are also referred to as biomolecules. So that's what the next worksheet is going to go into these a little bit more detail here, and part of it will be as a review. So once again, your 4 biomolecules: carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Carbohydrates are the most common type of organic compounds. Once again, they have repeating units called monosaccharides. Remember, carbohydrates have only 3 elements: the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. An example of a monosaccharide is a fructose or glucose molecule, and they can be linked together, and they can form polysaccharides. So basically for this here, you need to know that carbohydrates are the most common type of organic compound. They're organic because they contain carbon, and their building block is a monosaccharide. Okay. This down here is just a little bit more chemistry than what we're going to go into right now. Going to the next page, still talking about monosaccharides, but when you put 2 monosaccharides together, you get a little bit longer chain called a disaccharide. Multiples of these linked together, multiple boxcars of monosaccharides linked together, they form a polysaccharide. So carbohydrates, your examples are monosaccharides, disaccharides, or polysaccharides, but the building blocks of carbohydrates are monosaccharides. Group number 2 are your proteins. Another biomolecule, contains carbon. It's made of its smaller building blocks called amino acids. There are 20 different amino acids. When we start talking about cells replicating each other, we will go into how DNA makes a copy of DNA, and some of those are, and also the proteins will replicate also. So we'll get into a bit more detail. But you need to know that proteins are made up of amino acids, and examples of proteins are enzymes, which are just chemicals. They speed up reactions in your cells. Another example of a protein is an antibody, which helps to target certain bacteria and so forth. And then also another example of a protein on your blood is hemoglobin. That is what carries the oxygen from your lungs to different cells of the body. Your third category of biomolecules are lipids. And a lipid is an organic compound such as a fat or an oil. Very important because lipids make up your cell membranes. Your body's made of millions of cells and they're filled with water, but the lipids are important in keeping your cells hydrated because, water and oil don't mix. Well, the cells their membranes being made of lipid helps to retain the water in those cells and helps to control the amount of water that you lose when you become dehydrated. It kind of helps with all of that. So basically, you need to know that lipids are the third category of biomolecules. And your fourth category of biomolecules are nucleic acids, which are your DNA and your RNA. This is what helps to transfer the genetic material from one cell to another. And the building block of a nucleic acid is a nucleotide. And nucleotides are made up of a sugar, a phosphate, and a nitrogen base. We will learn that later. That will not be on this particular test. We start talking about the genetics portion of this class, about DNA replicating. We'll go into more detail about those, okay? And then the 4 different types of bases, you probably had adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, and RNA had uracil. And then here for DNA, adenine always goes with thymine, guanine always went with cytosine. And this would have been called probably a double helix right there. But we're going to save the rest of this material for when we start doing the genetics piece. So quite a bit of material. Basically, we started with talking about atoms. We started talking about atoms. And then we talked about what held atoms together, which would have been ionic or covalent bonds. And if the molecules are from living things and contain carbon, then they are classified as organic compounds. And with us, we're referring to basically the biomolecules, which are organic compounds. And we have 4 categories here, which were the carbohydrates, the lipids, the proteins, and the nucleic acids. So we start here with the basic building block of all the molecules. Depending upon where they're at, what they're allowed to form with, they'll form ionic or covalent bonds. And a lot of these are covalent also. Then we talked about carbon being able to have 4 bonds, allows it to bond with a lot of different types of atoms. And in living things, carbon-based compounds are referred to as organic compounds. And we also call them biomolecules, living molecules, or molecules of living things. And here are your 4 big categories. So that's kind of the chemistry component for right now. Touched on something like RNA, DNA. We'll get to that later when we start talking about genetics. But at least you'll know now that it is part of a category of organic compounds. Everything's made from atoms and elements. Alrighty, that concludes this particular video.